resuming here, we have monoamine oxidase inhibitors, or MAOIs, that were initially developed for the treatment of tuberculosis in 1951, but found to have mood elevating effects in patients. So in 1952, it was later found to inhibit the enzyme monoamine oxidase. At the time, most of these drugs were, just used trial and error. Very little was known about mechanism, or how these were actually functioning, like we are starting to have a better idea of now. So the clinical effect would be linked to the irreversible inhibition of the enzyme MAOA. This would result in preventing the degradation or breakdown of various monoamines, including norepinephrine. So what's happening here is very similar to what happens during tricyclic antidepressants. You see an increase in norepinephrine levels that would overstimulate postsynaptic beta and presynaptic alpha-2 receptors, causing a desensitization, that is the loss of the G protein coupled receptor, or downregulation, the complete internalization of the receptor. You also see immediate increases in norepinephrine release and in serotonin release, in additional serotonin receptors. The clinical effects might take several weeks to observe. There are a number of serious side effects, which is why MAO inhibitors and tricyclic antidepressants aren't used very frequently anymore. It's not that they are less effective than SSRIs. If anything, they might be more. But the side effects are quite serious. So, they sedate you. Who wants to be sedated all day? They have a relatively high risk of inducing postural hypotension, like where you, where the feeling where you stand up and you feel like you're going to fall to the floor. There are a variety of peripheral effects: inability to ejaculate, urinary retention, dry mouth, blurred vision, weakness, fatigue, and rashes. And also, the excessive central stimulation can result in tremors, insomnia, agitation, hypomania, dizziness, and vertigo. But most seriously, you can have what's known as hypertensive crisis. So tyramine is an amino acid from your diet that would typically be metabolized by MAO. But if you have an MAO inhibitor, it wouldn't. And high levels accumulate in the body, especially if you're eating food with tyramine in it. Food that can have tyramine in it or lead to elevations in tyramine include cheese, wine, beer, avocados, banana, chocolate. So, a lot of staples of our diet in America. So there's this potential interaction with that can even lead to death. I mean, this hypertensive crisis can kill you. MAO inhibitors, can also produce very serious toxic drug interactions. This kind of idea of serotonin syndrome was really common back, when I was in school, because at the time, club drugs like MDMA were very common and being used by kids, or like students, young people, who were also on antidepressant medications. And the increase in serotonin, from too much of like these drugs combined, can lead to very serious consequences, including death. But in general, the serotonin syndrome would be characterized by restlessness, tremors, rigidity, myoclonus, hyperreflexia, hyperthermia, sweating, hyperpyrexia, mental effects, seizures, coma. So in rats, so I'm an animal researcher, and in rats, when they're experiencing serotonin syndrome, which I have seen multiple times, especially when we've given large amounts of MDMA and other drugs, some of these, hyper reflexive responses become very apparent, and it's crazy to me. One of the more bizarre ones is the tail of the animal will stand straight up. So you think of it just the rat here, and then their tail is just standing straight up in the air. It's pretty bizarre looking. It's right, but that would be one example of the hyperreflexia. And right, this can be caused by co-administration of a variety of drugs or antidepressants with other drugs, like MDMA is certainly one that will do this, but it's not just MDMA either. Monoamine reuptake inhibitors are the most common antidepressants. This is what you probably think of when you think of antidepressants. And it's not so much that these are effective, they might be effective in about 50% of the population, but the issue, like they're just prescribed more because they're safer. Like they aren't going to kill you like the last two drugs, at least not as clearly. So fluoxetine or Prozac was sort of the traditional or most famous, antidepressant, but it isn't prescribed as much anymore. We now have a variety of SSRIs, including Zoloft, Paxil, and we also have SNRI. So, as you probably now appreciate after learning about MAO inhibitors and tricyclics, is that, other monoamines other than serotonin might be pretty important in some individuals. So we really might be better off using uptake inhibitors of serotonin and norepinephrine. And those are more effective in some people, but not all people. Which again, I think it's back to this idea that there could be more than one pathway in the brain that can lead to depression. So SSRIs are typically accepted as the agents of first choice because they're safer, but again, not necessarily better at treating depression. The last time that I studied this, the drug that I found that was approved by the FDA to treat depression, the only one at the time was fluoxetine, although sertraline and citalopram had been shown to be effective in clinical trials. I honestly have not followed up on that. I do not know the current state of what is approved to treat children depression these days, but I do know that fluoxetine was, and sertraline and citalopram have been shown that they have promise in children. SSRIs selectively block serotonin transporters. So they prevent the uptake of serotonin into the presynaptic cleft. So you flood the system with serotonin, and the precise role of serotonin in depression is not known. But again, it doesn't seem to be just about the overall level. You increase the system with serotonin, and in those first 2 weeks, you have very few positive effects. So it's not like increasing serotonin is the cure to depression, right? Rather, similar to tricyclics and MAO inhibitors, you're flooding the system with serotonin, and you're sort of hammering on oversensitive serotonin receptors, of which there are many more than there are of norepinephrine. So it becomes more complicated than saying that there's just the beta receptor, because there are over 20 serotonin receptors. But you most certainly see decreases in some of them, including the 5-HT1A receptor, the autoreceptor presynaptically. I think a lot of this parallels treatments for anxiety, which SSRIs are also used to treat. And the idea is serotonin actually makes you more anxious. So when you first start taking these drugs, especially if you suffer from anxiety as well, which is about 50% of the patients, you find that the anxiety is going to become much worse. So you start with a low dose of SSRI and increase it as the anxiety can become a little more bearable. But I think that's an important part of the process, unfortunately, because it's almost like you have to sit with it, if you will. Like you have to deal with the anxiety and have the receptors that are leading to this become deadened. Our tendency, I think, is to recoil from the situation that is causing the anxiety, or mitigate the anxiety with things like benzodiazepines or alcohol. And interestingly, these things, while they might be able to treat the anxiety in the short term, are probably going to make the anxiety worse in the long term. That is one of the many reasons that SSRIs are used to treat long-term anxiety, more so than buprenorphine or benzodiazepines, even though benzodiazepines might be much more effective in the short term. SSRIs produce a wide array of side effects that differ across individuals. These can include nausea, vomiting, headache, agitation, restlessness, sexual dysfunction, weight gain. The ion channel. So there's one serotonin ion channel, and that's the 5-HT3 receptor, and it's especially thought to contribute to several of these side effects. Serotonin syndrome, we've already gone over, but I mean, it can occur if you take too much of an SSRI or combine the SSRIs with things like MDMA. And there's a good bit of controversy with SSRIs, particularly involving suicides. I'm happy to speak to this issue much more. I've worked with drugs that have gone and have led to patients committing suicide in the clinic. So I guess I have strong opinions on the idea. One point that I think is worth keeping in mind is that this is a population that is already highly suicidal, with rates around 20%, and that's just in unipolar depression. It can be much higher in bipolar depression. But anyway, you are so if there's a 1 in 5 chance that a chronically depressed patient is going to commit suicide, it becomes very problematic to say that then that person either did commit suicide or did not commit suicide when you gave them the SSRI. It becomes, and then you get people that like Tom Cruise that are very, worked up, and they're very convinced that SSRIs are causing the suicides. But in reality, it becomes complicated because this group could have committed suicide anyway. So, right, in the case that I'm thinking, but yeah, it becomes very complicated, and I would say that it is not very clear. There is some interest in developing rapid-acting antidepressants. Ketamine is one that's being used currently. So if you have a patient that you might think is suicidal, you might consider ketamine as a rapid antidepressant that would have immediate effects. The problem with ketamine is normalizing its abuse will lead to more situations like Elijah McClain. Ketamine is also used to abuse others. Ketamine is a common date rape drug. Ketamine is a common club drug as well that's used and abused. Normalizing the use of ketamine is something that actually concerns me quite a bit. So I don't know about that. Electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT, is another approach that might lead to rapid improvement in depression, but that might scare you. Frankly, I'm a little more scared of ketamine, but to each their own. Overdose may result in CNS overstimulation and grand mal seizures. Those are the type where massive spread of epileptiform activity throughout the brain, and flailing of the limbs or seizures. Symptoms occur in 20% of patients. It can include dizziness. It can last for days. I mean, these are side effects: nausea, headache, fatigue, anxiety, irritability, sadness, nightmares, these feelings of brain zaps, like you sort of feel like electrical discharge, which might actually be just that. Burning, tingling in extremities, ringling in the ears, and blurred vision. Higher doses, can lead to a longer duration of these side effects and a greater risk of problems. Also, if you have a longer half-life of the drug, this can lower the risk of negative side effects. For example, Prozac, where you have a very long half-life, you get mild symptoms after about 6 weeks in 5% of patients. Some of these that have a greater risk would have a shorter half-life, or a shorter duration of action in the body. So one thing that you need to keep in mind with it when you are ending treatment on an antidepressant, the side effects of drastically or rapidly ending treatment can be very severe. So the solution there is simply that you need to taper the dose down toward the end, similarly to how you start treatment. You taper the dose up to help make this mitigate side effects, but the going off of a drug that's flooding your brain with a neurochemical is going to have a shock on the system. So you need to reduce that slowly. So now I want to talk about the HPA axis. So everything that we've talked about so far has been about monoamine theory of depression, like the idea that decreased serotonin, norepinephrine, or dopamine, could lead over time to maybe an upregulation of postsynaptic receptors that are too sensitive. So then, like even a little squirt of norepinephrine or serotonin or dopamine is going to have a profound effect. So in those cases, one treatment might be to flood the system with norepinephrine, dopamine, or serotonin and deaden the receptor response that has become oversensitive. But that doesn't work for everybody. That treatment might work in about 50% of people. Not everybody responds to that. So that suggests to me that there are multiple paths to depression in the brain. One, I think it very clearly involves the HPA axis. So the HPA axis is involved in your fight or flight response. The HPA axis responds to cortisol, like a stress hormone in your body, and its ability to regulate feedback, to respond to how much cortisol is there, to tune down the release of stress hormones or future stress hormones would be the normal response. And in some patients, it seems that the HPA axis loses its ability to respond to that feedback. So even though there might be a lot of stress hormones circulating in the body, and in a normal person, you would start shutting that down at some point in time. In others, there's this dysregulation and just the stress keeps building up through the body. So, here's that feedback sort of loop that I am generally referring to here. So the hypothalamus releases neurotransmitters that would then act on the pituitary gland right under the hypothalamus. That would then lead to the release of hormones. And things like ACTH that would then act on the adrenal cortex to regulate the release of cortisol. Cortisol is a stress hormone. It's going to have wide effects throughout the body, including on the immune system, and it's very much associated with sort of the fight or flight system. So if your brain has higher levels of cortisol, what should happen at some point is the hypothalamus starts to respond to that feedback and shut down the release of more cortisol from the adrenal cortex. Unfortunately, in some patients, that feedback control gets lost. So here is, I think, a very interesting graph showing that, in patients that have severe relapse with depression, you will find that cortisol is much higher in those that are continuing these relapsing feelings of depression. Whereas if you've had prolonged successful remission, your cortisol levels will be lower, suggesting, again, that there's this HPA imbalance, or you lose the ability to regulate feedback and respond to elevated cortisol. So you're not shutting down the release of more cortisol from the adrenals. Right. So there are many brain regions that are implicated in depression. We've already talked about the hypothalamus, which would be, down here toward the base of the brain. But you also have the, many other regions that are affected as well. The, midbrain areas here would be where a lot of the monoamine systems are acting. But we also now see profound changes in the frontal cortex of depressed patients as well. So I think that also deserves to be touched on. In general, you see decreased activity in the prefrontal cortex and anterior cingulate in depressed patients. And this has also been targeted with treatment. So we now have this thing called transcranial magnetic stimulation, where we can put magnetic coils over specific parts of the cortex and tune up or tune down activity in that brain area. One frontal cortical area, there have been multiple they typically refer to these as Brodmann areas in the human brain. And there have been several Brodmann areas that have been implicated in depression. I believe that Brodmann area 25 is what is currently being targeted with repeated transcranial magnetic stimulation for depression. But you might want to look that one up. There are multiple Brodmann areas that have been implicated in depression, and Brodmann's area 25, I think, is the current target of interest. Hippocampal volume is also decreased, proportionally with the number of days that a patient is depressed. So these would have been taken from post-mortem tissue as well, I might add. Neurotrophic factors, we've already talked about a little bit, but I mean, these would be things like, you hear about growth hormone a lot, but BDNF is one that's talked about a lot most in the neuroscientific community. This is a bone-derived neurotrophic factor. But again, there are likely many neurotrophic factors that play a role. It's not just going to be BDNF. Volumetric decreases in hippocampal and other regions in depressed patients have supported the hypothesis for depression involving decreases in neurotrophic factors. And several forms of stress reduce BDNF in particular in the hippocampus, whereas chronic treatment with antidepressants increases BDNF. BDNF expression is also highly related to suicidal tendencies, which is an interesting phenomenon. But BDNF is involved in cell health or growth, as well as apoptosis in an activity-dependent manner. Similar to many of the neurotrophic factors you see in these anti-aging clinics, which is, I have mixed opinions about, if you want my true feelings. I think that a lot of those are just money-making schemes. But anyway, BDNF, similar to like growth factor or human growth hormone, is critical for growth and function of a variety of cells, including those in the nervous system, and is involved in learning and memory. BDNF is expressed throughout the brain and in neurons and in glia. Monoamine neurons, interestingly, express BDNF the most. And this I already alluded to, but I find this incredibly interesting. Suicidal attempts may be associated with lower BDNF levels. Now, again, this is taken, right, like this is all a little, take it with a grain of salt. Many of these things that are assessed following a suicidal attempt or a successful suicide can be impacted by so many different factors that, like when you think of everything that might go into a suicide or a death, you would expect profound changes, and not to mention the suicide attempt itself or death could have actually led to the decrease in BDNF. So, like I said, I mean, it's an interesting correlation, but I would take it with a grain of salt. Successful antidepressant treatment can be associated with an increase in BDNF. In depressed patients, BDNF is lower. As you know, from suicidal patients, it's even lower. But in treatment patients, it slightly goes up. There are non-pharmacological treatments for depression. These include psychotherapy, electroconvulsive therapy, and vagal nerve stimulation. So ECT, or electroconvulsive therapy, is incredibly effective, and in my opinion, from my training in a biomedical hospital setting, incredibly safe. I have learned of very few negative effects and quite a few positive ones. And most importantly, it can produce rapid effects on depression, which is very important if you're worried about suicide. But ECT is done on an inpatient basis. The patient would be first anesthetized. Some of the early reports of ECT that produced negative effects were really just due to the loss of anesthesia. They didn't use that at first, and some of the patients had severe muscular responses in a non-anesthetized state. But if the patient is anesthetized, there are very few negative side effects. The electrodes are then placed on the temples of the patient, and the current produces seizures for 30 to 60 seconds. Then the patient awakens. They suffer a headache, nausea, and some temporary confusion and muscle stiffness. But the seizures would be induced 2 to 3 times a week, and then the treatment is usually for 3 to 4 consecutive weeks. Even when the depressed patients respond to treatment with antidepressant drugs, they do not do so immediately. The improvement in symptoms is not usually seen for 2 to 3 weeks. In contrast, ECT effects are much more rapid. A few seizures induced by ECT can often snap a person out of deep depression within a few days, which is incredibly important for suicide. ECT was made, if you view all the slides that I, started with, you'll see me alluding a little bit to One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. This was a 1970s movie starring Jack Nicholson that basically made this treatment seem so evil that nobody seeks it out anymore to this day. There's a lot of fear and negative associations with ECT that I don't think are merited based off data. Ketamine scares me a little bit for a variety of reasons. So, right, but we do need multiple approaches to deal with immediate depressive responses to deal with suicidal ideation. So now I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about the problems with the monoamine hypothesis of depression. So although SSRIs and SNRIs change the increase in levels of serotonin or norepinephrine in the brain very rapidly, the drugs do not relieve the symptoms of depression until they have been taken for several weeks. This fact suggests that something other than a simple increase in monoamine level is responsible for the normalization in mood. Many investigators believe that the increased levels of monoamines begin with a chain of events that eventually produce changes in the brain that are ultimately responsible for the antidepressant effect. The nature of this chain of events is still somewhat unknown. I mean, I think we know several key dominoes that fall, like the changes in the presynaptic autoreceptors is a pretty common phenomenon across all of these, whether it be the presynaptic alpha receptor or the 5-HT1A receptor in SSRIs. That would be one common domino. But I don't think that it's always going to be the same chain of events. I think it's going to vary a little bit depending on the treatment, and hopefully we can tailor that treatment to the individual changes that led to depression as we understand those more in the future. Now we're going to talk a little bit about circadian rhythms and sleep disturbances associated with depression. One of the most prominent symptoms of depression is disordered sleep. The sleep of people with depression tends to be shallow. Slow wave delta sleep from stages 3 and 4 is reduced and stage 1 is increased. Sleep becomes fragmented and people tend to awaken much more frequently when depressed. In addition, REM sleep occurs earlier. The first half of the night contains a higher proportion of REM periods, and REM sleep contains an increased number of rapid eye movements. One of the most effective antidepressant treatments is sleep deprivation, either total or selective. Interestingly, selective deprivation of REM sleep, accomplished by monitoring people's EEGs and awakening them whenever they show signs of REM sleep, alleviates depression. The therapeutic effect, like that of antidepressant medications, occurs slowly, though, and would occur over the course of several weeks. Some patients have shown long-term improvement even after the deprivation is discontinued. Thus, it is a practical as well as effective treatment. In addition, regardless of their specific pharmacological effects, other treatments for depression suppress REM sleep as well, delaying its onset and decreasing its duration. These results suggest that an important effect of successful antidepressant treatment might be to suppress REM sleep, and the changes in mood may be a result of the suppression. However, at least one antidepressant drug has been shown in a double-blind, placebo-controlled study not to suppress REM sleep. Thus, suppression of REM sleep cannot be the only way in which antidepressant drugs work. Also consider total sleep deprivation, which also has an antidepressant effect. Unlike specific deprivation of REM sleep, which takes several weeks to reduce depression, total sleep deprivation produces immediate effects. Typically, the depression is lifted by the sleep deprivation, but returns the next day after a normal night's sleep. It has been suggested that during sleep, the brain produces a chemical that has a depressogenic effect in susceptible people. This is just a figure showing antidepressant effects of total sleep deprivation. You can see that the graph shows the mean mood rating of responding and non-responding patients deprived of one night's sleep as a function of the time of day. Clearly, you would see continued depression in the one group. Now, let's end by talking a little bit about bipolar disorder. Bipolar 1 is a major depressive and manic disorder where you have not only depression, but also periods or episodes of high grandiosity, hypersexuality, and energy with little need to sleep. The epidemiology here is very low. Very few people suffer from bipolar disorder. Interestingly, there are no sex differences. It is highly pronounced in both males and females. I wouldn't say highly pronounced, it's rare, but equally pronounced. And there's usually an adolescent or early adult onset development. There's also a high comorbidity with alcoholism. And in general, there is a high correlation between depression in general and alcoholism and addiction. Here is just a curved cartoon demonstrating the poles of bipolar disorder and how you would fluctuate through periods of hypomania and major depression. Here's just another simple graph showing, in this case, the courses of unipolar depression, where there could be intermediate depressive periods. So in the case of bipolar, you still have that, but you also have these manic periods, also with the rapid cycling mixed state that can occur. Not that common, I believe, but you can also have this sort of mixed state, rapid cycling between mania and depression. Homeland depicts a very accurate portrayal of bipolar disorder with the character Carrie Matheson. If you watch this, it was a TV show that ended quite a few years ago. So, we could be past the point that you guys even know what the show is. But instead of her being either happy or sad, which is the layperson's understanding of bipolar disorder, this shows that the actual major depressive episodes, the manic episodes, and the psychosis can happen with bipolar disorder. Matheson experiences a variety of symptoms associated with bipolar disorder, including impulsivity and engaging in risky sexual behavior. Lithium is still, a common treatment for bipolar disorder. Lithium salts were accepted into American medical practice in 1970, and there is literature demonstrating that they can be effective in treating bipolar disorder relative to placebo. The mechanisms through which lithium act are pretty much completely unknown. It is not clear. Lithium is not naturally present in the body. Lithium inhibits depolarization provoked and calcium-dependent release of norepinephrine and dopamine, but not serotonin. In fact, it might actually increase serotonin in certain brain regions. It blocks the release of norepinephrine and dopamine in the brain, supporting the hypothesis, it mainly reflects overactivity of catecholamine transmission, and it blocks receptor-mediated actions of several hormones on adenylate cyclase. So this may alter and it may also alter the distribution of a variety of ions in the body that can be used in signal. So lithium probably has some very complicated and wide-ranging effects. Lithium therapeutically is used primarily to stabilize and control mania. Up to 70% of patients respond in 4 to 8 weeks. It's best at preventing suicide. Lithium in an antipsychotic is used to treat schizoaffective disorder and can also be used in highly agitated psychotic patients. It's used experimentally to treat episodic violence, alcoholism, and cluster headaches. So that is all that I have for affective disorders. I will see you in a few days with my last presentation on addiction.